story for us, and I think a lot of the story is just about the Israelites fail to keep the faith that God is going to look after them, and multiple times don't believe that that's the case, and have to be reminded that multiple times again that God is going to take care of them. So I think that's a message for us. I'll call on Darlene.
Thanks.
I think you're muted, Darlene.
Okay, now okay. One of the things that struck me was the wanderings in the wilderness were purposeful, and God created those as opportunities for learning. And I think back on my wanderings in the wildernesses of my life, and I know that I've learned a lot of lessons, most of them that God wanted me to learn. And then I think about the children of the Israelites that were wandering with them. And I wonder about how much they learned at their parents' side. And it makes me think about our children, my children, and what they've learned from my mistakes. And I see that they have learned some, but I also see them repeating my mistakes. And that's difficult. How about if I call on Ellen?
Thanks, Darlene. I think the thing that strikes me in these lessons is and first it was a negative thought, was that gosh, we are so stubborn, and God offers and we refuse, and it goes on and on and on, and it seems like, why do we have to repeat it all? But then as I was thinking about it and listening to this video, I recall that there's always been someone or someones who were faithful and listened to God and led us back. So that presence, I think, has always been with us, and it's very heartening to me. And I loved the definition of salvation that our Jewish brother spoke of this morning, and the fact that it's not the Old Testament, and Mike always refers to it as the Hebrew Scriptures, and I really like that because he pointed out that theirs is ongoing as ours is, and not an old and dead story that has no meaning. So I like that a lot from this morning's sharing. So Kay?
Kay, you're muted.
There, I got it. Okay. Good morning. I really enjoyed that video. I always enjoy the videos with this lesson, but I really enjoyed today's a lot. I struggle with Exodus because of all the violence in it, and I sometimes see God as being violent in it, with the killing of firstborn and that type of thing. And it's always been a struggle for me to read and study this, even though it's so important to our Jewish brothers and sisters. But as I read this more, I began to see it, I guess, in a different light. And I was really touched by a comment made in our study guide that seemingly many things God cannot or will not do without our hands. So I think that made me look at it in a totally different light, that he's presenting us with situations and asking that we use our gifts, talents, and love to change things. So as I read more, it touched me this time in a way it hasn't ever before. Jane?
I have to pass this morning.
I think you're left.
Thank you. I guess the first thing that crossed my mind as I read this, and I read the 2 chapters in the Bible study book. If God was a parent, he was a very bad parent. I would not want him to be my daddy. The way he was trying to get his people to kind of see what he was doing. I was impressed with the way it just flowed together. It just like it was just going along, and I saw a pattern there that I thought was very, very cool. That's all I have to say.
Thanks, Tim. I really appreciate the reactions you're having, and you're sort of sharing like where this is touching you. And so maybe I want to add to what a couple of you said about, like, there's this story arc about like the people don't get it. And I think I'm on this like kind of spiritual journey where I used to read that and think like, oh, people are so bad or stubborn or whatever, and like, what a pity God has to keep doing this. But I think now I'm trying to read it as, oh, like, look how loving God is. Like, God just like doesn't give up. And so like, it's really like a nice thing to claim, instead of feeling guilty about it, to say like, what a gift. And like, in some ways the story kind of resonates with like, I mean, when I don't know if you've had these moments, like there's stuff, your whole life you ought to be doing. And then like something will happen and it'll just like crystallize. And I don't know why it took that long or how that one thing did it, but that's been, continues to be my experience, where I'm like, oh, I'm really going to start making that commitment and living into that thing I should have been doing all along. But something happened recently that made that happen for me, And so like, to me, like those moments are probably like really what salvation is about. Barbara Brown Taylor, she's an Episcopal priest, and she says, salvation happens anytime somebody with a key unlocks a lock that they could just as well have locked. Which seems very based in the Exodus story, right? And actually, it's like Luke's version, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, has appointed me to proclaim good news to the poor, release to the captive, sight to the blind, proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, right? Like, and that takes salvation from being something very like, I don't know, ephemeral and like later, and really grounds it and embodies it in what we do. And I think that's one of the things I really appreciate about our Jewish brothers and sisters. We have this tradition in the church I grew up with, hearing the phrase like, take a leap of faith, take a leap of faith. And our Jewish brothers and sisters say, take a leap of action. So like, do the right thing, even if you don't feel like it, and the feelings will come. And probably they go together well, you know what I mean? But I think certainly the tradition I grew up in, we had so much focus on life after death that we kind of forgot to live now. So I probably, in what I do and what I pay attention to is like dramatic course correction, like, let's pay attention to life now. And I think there probably is this room for interplay, but I so appreciate having, and Will Willimon, by the way, is a bishop in the Methodist Church. So it's nice to hear this, you know, scholar and bishop having this dialogue with a rabbi. It's just really, really nice about how these things can be in complementarity. I don't know if there were specific, you know, things in the text that really drew your attention. Maybe I'll just comment. Oh, Tim, please.
Right. It would have been interesting to have an imam in on that discussion.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah,
just
I think it would have been really cool to have had an imam back when we did the Haggadah and the binding of Isaac, right? To talk about the Islamic understanding of Ishmael, right? And Ibrahim, and how that, like to do that dialogue would be pretty cool. Maybe that's when we can stage, because, you know, we've got an imam lives in Nassau Bay. He's over at the Islamic Center, and his name is Ibrahim. And like he's on like the assassination list for being a bad Muslim by, like, you know, the ISIS kind of group. So so he'd probably come over and talk to us sometime. It'd be pretty cool.
well, we went a few years ago. We went over to the Islam Center there on El Camino, and they were very friendly and very, very welcoming.
Yeah, that's their vibe. Actually, you know, this might be something we try to do in the season of Epiphany. One of our sister churches up in Waco does this with like different Christian traditions. They have like a set program where there's like 5 questions, and each like Orthodox Christians or Southern Baptists and Episcopalians, they all like answer these 5 questions as a program. They call that Theology on Tap, and I think they do it at a bar. Our Islamic brothers and sisters don't drink alcohol, so that wouldn't be something we could do. But I'd rather do it interfaith than do it with Lutherans, to be honest, you know, to be able to hear, like, you know, how do you approach these sorts of things? And I think like the local rabbi would come as well. I do think that maybe that's something we can shoot for.
And you know, we have that brand new Orthodox church up on Clinic Boulevard.
Yeah, we could probably get the priest to show up for that, because that's a kind of a Christian expression most of us don't know about. Yeah. You know, a couple of years ago, when I first got here, I want to say the first 3 years I was here, every Holy Week we did do the Carbin. That's a Jewish publication. We did a version of their Seder. I did the children's version. This is called in Hebrew, it's called the Haggadah, and it answers these questions. It's sort of like a catechism, like there's staged questions and answers. And this is still true, that even if you're at a senior center, the youngest person in the room has to ask these questions, and the oldest person has to answer them, even if the youngest person's like 100 and the oldest person's 101. You know, why is this night different from other nights? And so it sort of guides you through, and a meal is meant to like guide your remembering, not like, oh, this happened once upon a time, but like to connect you to the corpus body of this story, so that like you resonate. And he said it in the video, it's really interesting. Like, we don't say our ancestors were slaves in Egypt and God released them. The line is, we were slaves and God rescued us. And so there's like always this return to think about, in what ways have we found ourselves in bondage, economic, political, spiritual, physical, in the last year, and in what ways have we worked together to sort of break the chains of bondage? It's an interesting story to think about, like reflecting over the last year. Are there ways we've come out of bondage or guided others out of bondage? And that's one of these core stories in the Bible. Being released from bondage, coming home from exile. I mean, those are like, in some ways, you see those stories over and over and over again in the Hebrew Bible. Oh, are we clear on yeast and the Haggadah? Maybe I can comment on this, and if I bother you, let me know. You know, we do Passover. I don't know if you know this, Easter is not in sync with Passover. We quit that a long time ago, because Christian people are ridiculous. Sorry, we choose all kinds of crazy things to take stands on that are just silly. But you know, during the Passover week, we read it. You can't have any yeast in your home, and like the day before Passover begins, you don't just like throw out all the yeast. You vacuum the pantry and you wipe it down to make sure there's no residual yeast. And for what it's worth, yeast isn't bad. Like, it's not considered evil or wrong. It's just the trick was, right, they didn't have time for the bread to rise, so they just had to bake it because there was no Fleischmann's yeast. It's funny because that's a Jewish name, right? There's no Fleischmann's yeast, and there's no Red Star, right? The way they got yeast was either from sourdough kind of starter, or they just got it from the air. And you all may know this, like in San Francisco, the air is just naturally yeasty. So you actually can just make dough without yeast and leave it out. And the yeast that's in the air will slowly infuse that dough, and it actually will rise without any Fleischmann's. Now, it won't rise as much, right, as if you used some granulated or cubed yeast, but that's how they did it in the ancient world, not with packets, but essentially with sourdough, or just doing it from the air. So the issue was not that there's something bad or wrong with yeast, it's that they didn't have time. They had to bake the bread before it could rise, right? And so this is just a reminder, is we're not going to wait to leave bondage. We're going to go now, right? So we're not going to wait on bread to rise. We're not going to wait on the priest to slaughter a lamb. Every family does that themselves. This is the only time you kill your own animal, right? Otherwise, you take it to the Levite. And then there's this bit of blood on the door. And a lot of times, sadly, we retroject some kind of strange perspective about the Passover lamb being a sacrifice for sin. And of course, when you read the story, that's not what that's about at all, right? There's no language of sin in Passover. None. The blood, remember, contains the life. In the ancient world, blood is a symbol for life. And if you remember your kosher food laws, you can't have the blood of an animal because the life is not yours. The blood has to be returned to the ground because the life of the animal belongs to God. And this is still true, right, that in certain cultures, the idea that you consume parts of an animal and you get the animal's powers. I don't know if you've heard this, but this is why people eat like tiger penises and rhino horns, because they're trying to get like the chi of the animal, like the spiritual essence. Some people eat monkey brains while the monkey's alive, with this understanding that they're getting like the brain power of the monkey. I mean, this is true. Like, I had an exchange student that had done this, right? So this happens. And that prohibition is saying, like, you don't get the chi of the animal, like that goes back to God. So, you know, a lot of times we think about blood as this like sacrifice to cover up some sin, but it's really showing like, I didn't try to steal the life force of the animal. And, you know, this Passover thing, rather than it, again, there's no priest involved. So it's not a sin thing. It's that you're getting ready to go walk a lot. And lamb is full of calories. It just is. So really, this is an image of food for the journey more than it is substitutionary penal atonement. I hope it's okay that I said that. So when we talk about Jesus being the Paschal Lamb, right? He's not a vicarious substitute for sin. I mean, I guess he could be, but that's not it. That's not the only thing. It's supposed to be food for the journey, right? And when we think about the way that expands what the Eucharist means, right? The goal is not that you eat this bread and you drink this wine and it's some kind of like sacrifice that covers up all the bad stuff you did in the last week. I mean, I guess it could be that, but centered in this Passover idea, this is nourishment for the journey you're going to take right now. And it's a journey that should be out of bondage for you and other people. And this food is supposed to nourish not just your body, but your spirit, so that you can engage in this journey out of bondage. That's a Eucharistic tradition that we've lost in the American church, because if you know your history, we wanted our own bishop after the Revolutionary War, and England wouldn't give us one. So we had to go to Scotland, who didn't love England, and they gave us one, but with the understanding that we used the Scottish Rite, R-I-T-E, instead of the Anglican Rite. In the Anglican Rite, it's called the Lord's Table, and it's food for the journey. In the Scottish Rite, it's called an altar, and it's a propitiatory sacrifice. So you know, the first prayer book in the United States, it was predicated on the Anglo-Catholic understanding of altar sacrifice instead of table nourishment. We had been table nourishment as a colony, but we made that shift in order to get autonomy through bishops. And if you look at the 76 prayer book, it's slowly starting to return back that it's sort of both and. It's both and, but a lot of us, I'll speak for myself. I grew up with and I didn't grow up Catholic at all, right? I grew up evangelical, but I grew up that the Eucharist is a symbolic of sacrifice instead of, and sacrifice means to make sacred, right? That's really what it means, but we associated that with death and substitution instead of holy energy for a journey out of bondage. It's interesting that we grew up like kind of afraid of communion in the church I grew up with, because if you didn't think about it the right way, it could damage you. And that just seems really different from grace. It seems like grace is always helpful. Like, you know, like I don't really know how grace can hurt you. So I kind of think if you're like not sure about communion, you absolutely should take it. That's just me, right? Because grace seems to always be helpful. Our Jewish brothers and sisters don't eat lamb at Passover any longer. Ever since the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in the year 70, lamb has been stricken from the Seder menu. We had some here, not because we were being authentic, like in the contemporary sense, but to recreate the Exodus meal. Ellen, sorry, you unmiked, you're set.
I really love the food for the journey thought, because then we get fed every week to be able to move forward in, hopefully in grace, and I really love that. And you mentioned something about what we do to get out of bondage, and I think we as our particular parish have done that in our streaming services, so that people who can't be physically with us are spiritually with us and are fed for the journey themselves. So I think that's been one of the greatest things that we've done through the pandemic.
Thank you. I really appreciate that, Ellen. And, you know, for me, when I think of it as food from the journey, taking it every week doesn't water down its meaning. In fact, every week is not enough. It actually, at the words of institution, which every Eucharistic prayer has to have, this is, you know, this bread is my body, eat this in remembrance of me. But the way we say it in the kids' Eucharist, which is right 3, and it, by the way, is a possibility of the text. Whenever you eat bread, do it in remembrance of me. Whenever you eat bread. And of course, like this is a fundamental human necessity, like on Maslow's hierarchy, this is bottom base, right? Food. And in the ancient world, particularly in Israel, bread was 90% of your diet. So like some of us were very selective about carbs and gluten and all of that. But whenever you eat bread, that was every day, like 3 or 4 times. And so that like this is this ongoing thought that food nourishes our body, but it's also this opportunity to be nourished in community with the way that we choose to eat, and that we can make this association between nourishing our bodies and nourishing our spirits and one another, and not just on Sundays, especially not just quarterly. I mean, if you're like me, God, like I'll run out of spiritual energy in 5 minutes. And I don't think that means I need to be popping wafers all the time, But I do think there's this like really interesting mystical tie between like, as you meet your physical needs, can the body of Jesus's life and ministry also meet your spiritual needs, and can you meet the needs of other folk? Maybe we'll do a Seder again sometime soon. It's a little bit interesting. You probably know that song Dayenu. Do you know Dayenu? It's a Hebrew song you sing, and it means it would have been enough. And it's sort of the central part of one of the central parts of the Haggadah, the Seder, is you say this line, Dayenu, 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 it would have been enough. And then the verses say, you freed us from Egypt, you freed us from oppression. If that's all you done, it would have been enough. You gave us the Torah to guide our lives. If that's all you done, it would have been enough. But like, it doesn't stop. It continues for several verses to say like, you've exceeded enoughness. Like you've gone to abundance with us. And it's an interesting thing to think about, like this idea that God goes overboard. And that's set into this ritual meal of deliverance. There's a line in Exodus that John Wesley picks up. It says the Hebrew people plundered the Egyptians. And John Wesley wrote a really long sermon about what that really means is that scholarship belongs in the church. That's how you plunder Egyptians. Like you read evolutionary development, and you read like psychology, and you read the Mahabharata, and that's how you plunder the Egyptians. Like you take wisdom wherever it comes from. It's an interesting essay. I'm not sure I love the idea about plunder. It seems a little tough, but this idea of incorporating, wisdom wherever it shows up is it's like a lovely Wesleyan thought. I don't want to overdo the lecture, but I'll just say three more things about lesson 11, and then maybe we can go forward. You notice that Moses sings a long song, I will sing unto the Lord, for God has triumphed gloriously, the horse and rider thrown into the sea. And then it continues. And then Miriam sings that same song, but it's shorter. Almost every scholar will tell you Miriam's like the older version because it's shorter and it's the voice of a woman. And then over time, Moses has got longer and it's the voice of a man. I just want to point out that there's some evolution in the text on that. I mean, really, like when people read ancient manuscripts, the shorter one is the preferred reading because, the thought is as time goes on, people expand, they don't usually contract. So that's a thing. This text never mentions the Red Sea. It's the Sea of Reeds, the Yam Suf, and nobody knows where the Red Sea is. I know where the Red Sea is, but nobody knows where the Red Sea is. And it's very possible it was like a marsh. That does, if you think about it, that doesn't like take the miracle out. Like if you can drown the Egyptian army in 6 inches of water, in some ways that's like kind of more miraculous than like putting them under the ocean, right? And there is this weird line, and I think it's weird, and this is where I think if you've seen Gods and Kings, the Ridley Scott version, where God shows up like as kind of a petulant child, I see where he gets that read from the text because he says, I'm going to gain glory for myself over Pharaoh. Well, that's kind of weird, isn't it? Like, it's like a God versus a human being. That's like a Great Dane beating up a Chihuahua. Like there doesn't seem like there's a lot of glory in that, right? I mean, like, you know what I mean? Like, that's like a Navy SEAL versus like a pre-K 3 kid, like it's just funny to think about gaining glory in that. That's why I think it's nice to hear from the rabbi that there's this different perspective, right? That God actually demands silence in heaven over the loss of God's Egyptian children. And actually, part of the Haggadah, if when you do this Seder meal, you're celebrating the story, but there's also a time where you dip your finger in the salt water and you taste it, God's tears for the Egyptians. And this great reminder that as far as we know, I mean, we don't know what the Egyptians wanted. We just know Pharaoh is a ruthless dictator. So like part of the story reminds us that there's collateral damage for an entire people group when government goes wrong. I mean, it's an interesting thought, right? That our leaders, of course, have responsibility and privilege that trickles down to everybody else, regardless of everybody else's, piety or motives or goodness. And that's part of the responsibility of government, right? Was anybody on the screen? Is anybody a firstborn? Just Ellen. Did your parents redeem you? Did they redeem you? Darlene, did your parents redeem you?
You're both muted. Yeah.
Not that I know of.
I'm thinking that they did not redeem you or break the neck of their firstborn donkey, right? Like, I don't
No,
think
they
did
didn't do
that.
And what do you mean by redeem?
Well, we read that in the text this week in Exodus 13, that you either have to redeem your firstborn or kill it. So you're consecrating your firstborn as the Lord's, or you're going to sacrifice it. I mean, there's this mythology that we don't exactly get. And keep in mind, right, Abraham offers his firstborn son, just like other Canaanite people were doing to gods like Molech and Chemosh, with this understanding the firstborn belongs to God. And, in the Hebrew scriptures, you shouldn't kill the firstborn as a sacrifice to God, but you have to redeem that child, which is sort of like they're consecrated and they belong to the Lord. This has fallen out of practice. I don't know anybody who does that. Although I will say that my mother-in-law, she said the whole time she parented, she tried to have the perspective that these were not her children. They were on loan, which is interesting. It's an interesting perspective.
I like that perspective, but I can say that my parents not only didn't redeem me, but in a figurative way, they killed me for most of our relationship.
That's tough.
It is tough, and it's, you have to decide whether you're going to let that color the way you live. It took me a long time to decide that I didn't need to carry that.
If you didn't mind me saying, I just have been reading. Darlene, have you read this book, The Body Keeps Score? You probably are familiar with the ideas in it. And the book talks about trauma and PTSD and all kinds of things like that. But the book says this really interesting thing. Sometimes we tend to rate abuse and we'll say like, oh, you were verbally abused, but you weren't physically abused. So like somehow that's different. But apparently abuse equally malforms your brain. So there's actually like no hierarchy of what different abuse does to your brain, which is all really bad.
I have not read the book, but I am very conscious of that concept. And quite often I will ask someone, where are you feeling that in your body? Whatever that is.
Yeah.
And they can identify where they carry the tension, where they carry that feeling. And interestingly enough, oftentimes we develop physical illness in that particular part of the body.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you say that. And I've had massage therapists who have said like, oh, you've got a knot in your shoulder. What are you carrying there?
Yes.
And my perspective is like, I was overzealous when I was swimming. And they're like, no, because that's been there. That's a thing. The book also says this really interesting thing, which is that one of the difficult things about trauma, which makes it different from memory, is that memory is stuff that happened in the past, but trauma tends to not be a past event for people who have experienced it. Like, it's ongoing and it like bleeds into the present. And so like one of the ways that you try to treat trauma is turn it into a memory. Like, that happened and that's over. Most people who talk about having PTSD, they actually have TSD. They have traumatic stress disorder, and there's no post about it for them. If you can get to post, you've made progress, right? Like my dad was a war veteran, and there was no post trauma for him. You know, without his bidding, he would have dreams or flashbacks. So, you know, of course, those things happened in the past, but in his sort of memory or being, they weren't over. And that's a tough thing. Many of you know, like, PTSD didn't show up until after Vietnam, like 1980 is when it was a condition, right? So consider that World War I, World War II, Korean War, and Vietnam vets didn't get any of that consideration. It was like, oh, you were a weak person going in. You don't need a psychology lesson, but it is interesting to think about that, Ellen. And I think, like, taking the text seriously, like, not just how do we redeem our children, but how do we redeem our upbringing is a tough one.
I think for me, there was a point in time where, with a lot of help, I learned that I had much to offer other suffering people because of what I had been through. And for me, that turned it into a positive thing.
Yeah. There's this really interesting line, right? When all the firstborn kids have died, and the Pharaoh says, go away. But he also says, and pray for me also. It's an interesting line, that the oppressor brought low is now asking for prayer. That's an interesting line. And what I really appreciate, Ellen, about the risk you just took is that this is where that story connects with our life. I mean, sometimes I think we can think about pharaohs being like these extra experiential people, but, you know, like what the African-American spirituals do very well, right, is they identify Pharaoh as slaveholders. and that's like a real social justice, but there are many pharaohs in our life.
Mike, the Pharaoh story, I mean, that line did touch me. And then God turns around, knowing that he recognized that, you know, Moses' God was the God, and he hardens his heart.
Yeah.
And he did the same thing in the Joseph story. Just when Pharaoh seems to be understanding the goodness and power of God, he hardens his heart. And I just really struggle with, why wouldn't God want Pharaoh who's in charge of all of his people, to come to him with his people? Why did he keep doing that?
I don't have a really great answer for that, Kay. My thinking on it, which is going to sound like I'm, you know, massaging the problem you're raising, which is a real problem I can't solve, is that in my own life, there are times where I know better. I so know better. And then I go back to like really dumb, self-destructive, other destructive behavior. And I knew so much better, it's almost like something took control of me. And I don't know if that's the description. I would have I'm just going to say I have a really hard time that God would like take control of somebody else's will to make a point. And to be honest, like I can't accept that. So I have to do something else with the story. It puts me in a bucket where I have to say, this is a human perception, or it's trying to describe this very strange experience I've been in where like, I know not to yell at my kids. And then I yell at my kids And it's almost like something supernatural came over me because I so knew in my head not to do that.
I tend to go with your thought about this is human perception of what happened. And my thinking would be that perhaps the people who were interpreting this ancient story needed to feel like God was in control. And it was God's doing. Perhaps.
And I think that's an interesting tension. And it goes back to something you'd said, Kay, about like struggling with the violence, but then there's also like, what do we do with our own hands? And, you know, like there's that cartoon probably you've seen where there's a guy sitting on the bench with like Jesus, and he says to Jesus, I just don't understand why you allow children to go hungry and people to be abused. And Jesus says, like, that's funny. I was going to ask you the same question. Like, it's this really interesting dialectic between all of that. Right. I don't know that I've got a great answer, because I sometimes see people do things that are beyond them in the most positive ways, you know, and usually I say like, wow, that was a miracle of grace. But if I'm honest, I see people do things that are negatively beyond them too. And that seems also miraculous, but I'm not convinced it comes from the Lord. I don't know if it was clear when we were reading the story that Exodus and Numbers present also very different visions of God. Some of the facts are the same, but like God's thinking is really different. Like replicated stories, the people are complaining in the desert and they're hungry, and God's like, okay, well, I'll just give you some manna. And in Numbers, they're complaining and God's like, I'm going to kill all of you. And I just want to suggest to you, like, it's interesting to think that like both are giving different depictions of God's mind. And when you think about it reasonably, like when you're in the desert, well, of course, you're going to complain about not having food. There's nothing to eat. And when little children complain about being hungry, you rarely does a parent say like, you are so evil for being hungry. Usually you say like, okay, here you go. Or sometimes it's frustrating. It's like, boy, I just fed you like an hour ago, but okay, we'll find you something. You know, rarely is it, I'm going to have meat coming out your nostrils, and while you're chewing it, I'm going to kill you. That sounds like a Grimm Brothers fairy tale. And to be honest, I read the book of Numbers like middle school literature. Numbers seems like it was written to instruct children not to complain. And it was written by parents who were telling cautionary tales, right? But I mean, again, reasonably, people who have been eating like the gift of the Nile their whole life, and now they're in the middle of like a dry desert, like what are they supposed to do? Numbers, we read it too. It was in the reading. Numbers, I can't pass this up, even though it's not an Exodus. It has this crazy story where Miriam and Aaron are jealous about Moses's authority, so they choose to like knock on his wife. This is so weird, right? And they ridicule him for marrying a foreigner. And it's very, I mean, I'm not injecting this read. She's from Cush, so it's very likely she's darker skinned. And there's this very ironic punishment that God makes Miriam's skin as white as snow by giving her leprosy. I mean, like, that is crazy. I sure hope God doesn't do that. But it is this very interesting anti-racism story that shows up in Numbers. And I don't know why I didn't hear that interpretation of the story, but this is God. I mean, again, the people are picking on what? Some difference in melanin. I mean, that's what they're picking on Moses about. And then God's like, fine, I'll take all the melanin out of your life, and you'll be as white as you can be. And you know, the whitest things I've ever seen are corpses, right? And so like Miriam is like a zombie. And why it happens to her and not Aaron, I don't know, because the two of them were in that together, and it's the lady that gets it first. This is just a wild story, I don't know how you can read Numbers and not cringe. I just have to be honest. Like it's a wild ride of a book. Like if you haven't read the book of Numbers, I'd encourage you to read it and like make sure you've got some like Tylenol first. And like you do some deep breathing, because like the earth opens up and swallows people. Snakes come out of the wilderness and just start biting people, and they don't go away. They keep biting the people. It's just God gives them an antivenom by creating an idol. Like it's just very weird. And so I hope you can see when you read these stories side by side, these are definitely from different sources, and they're emphasizing different things. And I think one way to hear it is never complain, or you can hear it in Exodus that like you complain to people you trust who have the ability to help you. Sometimes I wonder if Numbers doesn't tell us more about ourselves than God. Like sometimes I imagine God is so frustrated with me. Like, why do you keep making those mistakes? And so I'm going to, get even with you. But I think that says a lot more about me than it does about God. Do you notice that they put some manna in the ark, but there's not an ark? They haven't made that ark yet, so I don't know where it came from. That's called an anachronism.
Yeah, I noticed that too. I don't think we make the ark until about Exodus 25.
Yeah, that's it. So this happens all over the place, it turns out, in the Hebrew Bible, these anachronisms.
We don't even have the 10 Commandments yet.
Not at all, no.
Or where we are anyway.
Yeah, and it's like when we read the Noah story, right? Take 7 of every clean animal. Well, which ones are clean? Like, we don't get that until the book of Leviticus. I don't know if your Bible gave you this note. Manna is a Hebrew word, and it means, what is it? So they got the bread of heaven, and they didn't know what it was. That's an interesting thought, isn't it? That God sends the bread of heaven to us in our wilderness, and we don't know what it is. Seems like that's what evangelism's about, right? Like, hey, I've got some insight into what the bread of heaven is. Let me show you where you can gather that up for yourself. Did you notice Moses' father-in-law Jethro converts? He's like a pagan priest, and then he's like, oh, well, your God is like stronger than the other gods. He's still a polytheist, but he converts. And then gives Moses advice.
I'll have to go back and read that. I didn't.
It's in chapter 18.
Okay.
Because Jethro is the high priest of Midian. But it's, this gives you insight that he's a priest to other gods first. And now he's going to like do some priestly service. And it's weird because Jethro really can't be a priest. He's not related to Moses. Like, the priests come from Moses and Aaron, and Jethro is not one of those.
That was an interesting story of Jethro teaching Moses how to delegate. I mean, it was kind of a sidebar of the story a little bit. I mean, a good lesson, of course, but you wonder why they interjected that there. Why it had to come from Jethro. I guess maybe Jethro is the more senior, but interesting story.
There must be something going on, Herb, that like people took for granted, such that they didn't write it. you know, like perhaps in ancient Israel, there were 70 elders, and this is an origin story for why there's 70. And maybe Jethro represents some kind of sage figure, and that's a little bit lost on us, you know, but like he had some like popularity behind the text that we just haven't maintained.
Yeah, it's almost like the people who lived it understood the context that we don't.
I think that's got to be the case. Like when we read Genesis 6, right? And the sons of God looked on the daughters of men and had the heroes of old. What the heck is that? Do you notice that no one can touch the holy mountain, or they have to be stoned, or they have to die? Even an animal? That's weird, isn't it? This is kind of weird. Hard to know if that was like our idea or God's idea. Don't you think? There's this story, you know, and I see some folks play this out. I used to go to Episcopal church, like in a demographically changed area, with this lady who'd wear opera pearls. And before she'd go up to the rails, she'd put on gloves. Even if she didn't have them on, she'd put the gloves on. And there's this Catholic tradition, I don't know if you've seen it, where some of our Roman brothers and sisters, they won't accept the bread in their hand. They open their mouth so you can put the host right in their mouth. And that actually comes from this idea that you're not worthy to touch it with your hands. And the gloves are actually a little bit related to that too. And it's interesting that the priest who started Homeboy Ministries, Greg Boyle, he when people come to get communion from him, and they got their mouth out, he puts it in their hand anyway. Like makes them take it in their hand, so they have to contend with the fact that whether they feel worthy or not, God has decided that they are. And that's an interesting thought about this mountain experience. Maybe it really speaks to how we feel. We feel unworthy. We feel like we can't touch this holy stuff. And it nails us, right? That's how we feel. It's just that that's not true. I tell my acolytes to take their gloves off. We talk about blessing other people and how, I don't know if you know this, but every Shabbat in general, Jewish people will bless their kids at home. Like they'll put hands on them and give them a blessing. And I mentioned this a couple of years ago, and somebody on the call or somebody in the class was like, am I worthy to give people a blessing? It's such a funny thing, isn't it, right? Am I worthy? And then the answer is yeah, you are. I know this chapter seems like it's a contradiction of that, but I want to suggest it's not a necessary contradiction. I think it explains how we feel. And our feelings are very real. They're just not always true. I'm afraid I did more preaching than normal today. I'm sorry, folks. Any other, let me give you the microphone back. Any closing thoughts or reflections?
Well, I have a thought. It's a crazy thought about not approaching the mountain. And maybe Moses is the one who had that idea because maybe he was getting big-headed, you know, because then Jethro is telling him, you need to delegate. You can't be the only one who can do all of this. You need people to help. So I wonder if it was just a caution against Moses has been the man, you know, and we tend to to put our leaders on a pedestal, really whether they want to be or not. So I wonder if some of that might be going on in that story.
Good point, Ellen. Maybe it's just a story about they're teaching the church to organize itself, and and it can't just be one person.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what the story's about. Good point.
It's an interesting thought too, because I'll tell you, for like a workaholic perfectionist like myself, that enlisting other people is really difficult. The lesson I learned from group work in middle school is that I cannot rely on the rest of the group when my grade is involved. And so I need to super function to make sure I protect my grade. And this is one of those ways in which rewarding groups with grades is actually punishing, because it actually teaches the opposite lesson of like working together. And it's hard, right? Because sometimes when you've got a strong vision for something, you kind of have to let that go to get other people involved. They may not do it the way you wanted or at your time scale. And we all have to contend with that. Life is just lived that way. Like, people don't return emails with the same like urgency I do, and it was funny. It's like, it frustrates the hell out of me, still. I mean, it just drives me crazy. Going to write like the story I'm making up in my head about you're not returning this email within 24 hours is, and then it's a really ugly story that I want to make up, And so like, I think there's this tension, right? And of course, what the story says, if you don't do that, you're probably going to burn yourself out. And you're going to become like irreplaceable. And so when you die, the people will die with you, because you didn't give them anything to take care of themselves with. So it's always, I think, this like back and forth,
One of the things I really love that you do is when somebody comes to you with an idea for a project or something, you immediately say, wonderful, you can be in charge, or would you take charge, or whatever, and you don't take it on yourself. I think that's fantastic.
Of course, it doesn't usually happen.
Of course, it doesn't usually happen. They really want you to do it, or we, I should say, really want you to do it. But it's also a beautiful way to invite people to become more involved and to take ownership of some of the things that are important to them. So thank you.
Well, I appreciate that. Again, I find it's very, very hard for me, because, the feedback I get from people who know and love me is like, man, your pace is so high, it's hard to keep up. And of course, to be honest, I judge myself that way too. Like, I don't just inflict that on other folk. Like, I get the scrutiny of that more than anybody, which can be hard to live with sometimes. But this is a great reminder. And, it's going to sound funny. I tend to be actually like pretty evaluative of other clergy that I don't perceive are doing much. But sometimes that's one of the gifts they give a congregation, is by not doing anything, then y'all got to do your work. I think it'd be a tough transition for y'all if your next priest played Spider Solitaire in the office most of the week. I think that'd be a tough one. But it might be helpful too. Who knows?
Let's don't find out anytime soon.
Just one thought toward the end here. The video is at the beginning of this morning. It's worth reflecting on that when we read about the Hebrews or the Israelites, they're doing, they have these problems, they fail, they lose their faith, this or that. Instead of seeing it as we see it as we, and because that is us,
Yeah.
And so, and they are our lineage, so too, as well. So,
I don't know if you guys have ever been involved in a godly play lesson. Godly play is this Montessori-based curriculum, and Amy Tones taught one in the middle of church to model it, and it's made for like little kids. But the truth about good pedagogy is it's like good pedagogy is good pedagogy. Like, it kind of works for all ages. And the questions they ask every week are, where are you in the story? So they really invite people to not think about a story as a past thing. The question is like, in what ways are you in the story? What would you change about not just the story, what would you change about your story? I mean, that's really what it's asking. Where are you and what would you change about your story? And who do you most identify with? That's those kinds of questions, right? Which is really where scripture becomes a book that reads us. You know, sometimes we think we just read the book, but more often than not, the book reads us. I'm really grateful for your willingness to take these risks and think about where you are in the story, which I perceive happened today. Thank you all for that. Reminder that next week, and it's in the e-news, next week, we are on Thursday morning to accommodate clergy conference, and we're only doing the one lesson, lesson 13. It'll be 9 to 10:15 like normal next Thursday. Thank you. I really, really appreciate you. And I'll see you then, if not before.
See you Thursday.